So this morning we continue our sermon series on the Apostle Paul and a brief introduction on his life and his ministry. And I say brief because those of you who know the New Testament know that Paul has written almost a third of the New Testament. And Paul was the reason why the church expanded beyond a sect of Judaism. Whoa, wow, that's new. There we go. Now I'm on the Jumbotron. So my first experience in preaching with this up in the front, it was actually when all of a sudden everyone was looking at the screen, and I was thinking to myself, I am really not engaging, because that's why I don't like to have notes, is I like to engage. And then I realized Tim Ellington was looking at a screen because I was preaching at a place where there was a screen. Some of you know Tim, he's the previous pastor here. But anyway, first experience. Second experience, when you all look up and see me up there. Surprises happen all the time, right? But Paul's ministry was full of surprises. Because the thing about Paul's ministry is that Paul was on the road to persecute Christians. That's what he was planning to do. And then on that road, a surprise came to him. And that surprise was Jesus Christ. And it transformed his life. And we began this series when I said that if you understand that moment for Paul, you understand his life and his ministry. Because I think that the rest of his life is coming to terms with that single event. And last week we jumped forward to the end of his ministry, to the letter to the Romans, which is the last letter that we have of the Apostle Paul. And it's his theology treatise to these people that he had never met. And rather than beginning with his argument, he puts his thesis statement right in the middle of that book, right in 5 to 8. And in the middle of that, he begins with saying that while we were weak, at the right time, God made us right with God through Jesus Christ. And that we were enemies, and that we were sinners. And it was in that very moment that God did these things. And at the end of it, it says that nothing can separate us from the love of God. And if you put those two and two together at his beginning of his ministry and his end of his ministry, it makes complete sense, right? Because while he was an enemy of God, literally an enemy of Jesus Christ, he was transformed, and that nothing from that point on would ever change that relationship, that nothing could separate him from God's love. And so what began his ministry was there in the end, but the reality is that Paul was working out what that meant. He was working out what that meant in his ministry because if you know, when he began his ministry, he began the ministry and God called him to preach the good news of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles. Which for us doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, other than that, he's going out and preaching the good news to people that weren't part of his community. But for an ancient Jew, that would be like, if you are familiar with the story of Jonah, God calling Jonah to preach the good news to the community that they despised the most. That the Gentile community in ancient Rome was all of the empire. That's how the Jews referred to anyone who wasn't Jewish, and the Jewish people were an occupied minority by the Roman Empire. And Paul was called to preach the good news to them. I remember my first experience with cross-cultural interactions, because that's what was happening with Paul here. He was called to preach the good news to people who were radically different than himself. He was called to preach the good news to people from a different culture, a different background, and cross-cultural interactions are difficult. I grew up in a small town in Minnesota, and a small town in Minnesota is a very white, mono-ethnic culture. Very different from your experience if you've grown up in Hawaii. But it wasn't until the 6th grade that experience began to change. I remember prior to 6th grade, I could count the amount of people I knew in our entire community that weren't white, probably on 2 hands. And then all of a sudden, we had this kind of immigration of Somali refugees that began to settle in the 90s because of all the devastation that had happened in Somalia. We knew nothing about Somalia. We were like trapped in the middle of the United States in Minnesota, right? I mean, I was in 6th grade. I didn't know about world history and the dynamics that were causing refugees to come. All I knew was that they were different, right? They wore different clothing. They ate different food during school. They prayed differently than the friends. I didn't pray at that point in my life, but I knew that they had a special room to do that in, and they would pray differently than the rest. And so everything was different about them. They had a different language, and it was disruptive to that small town community. And we didn't know what to do with how we might be one. And of course, what happens in a small community sometimes is when you have this new migration of people, that those different people became bad people because they weren't part of the way it's always been done. That learning English as a second language brought down our school systems because teachers now had to cater to all the students in the classroom, not just the students who had grown up in that town. That all of a sudden, the Somali community, which is Muslim, if you don't know, a lot of Muslims don't practice usury, which is the word that we use for interest. And so they don't take on interest from banks. And so that made them unable to buy houses in our community, which we're a small middle class community. And that totally disrupted the way that people normally practiced being a middle class person. They would go and buy a house, and instead they would rent in these condominium or apartment complexes. And that disrupted those communities because they would kind of flock to the same area and create these communities because they're very communal people. And I remember thinking to myself how different they were. And it wasn't until later on in college, actually post-college, when I found myself in Japan teaching English, that I realized in hindsight how my perspective and that community's perspective on these Somali refugees was steeped in sort of cultural expectations for them. That I didn't realize then, this prejudice, that like the problem that was created when I was in high school, because that's what everyone was narrating as a problem to have these refugees in the community, I didn't realize that was actually steeped in my way of living that was a very narrow perspective of life. Because when I went off to Japan, I realized that, this worldview that I've lived in forever is totally different than my own. I mean, I lived in Japan for a year teaching English, and as I was there, I was in rural Japan. And those of you who know rural Japan, when I walk in, because I'm a tall white guy, I walk into the community, all eyes go on me, right? Because I'm not only taller, but then also I'm different than everyone else. And I remember that experience of what it looked like to go into the grocery store and being totally unable to read what's on the labels. And having the experience of trying to figure out, okay, so is this tuna with water or tuna with oil? And I do not like tuna with oil, and I always got that wrong. Some of you have lived in Japan or other places, or through its armed services or various other opportunities, know that cross-cultural divides, on the surface, we're all, we like to think of ourselves as very similar, but then you rub up against things that are very different, practices that are very different, and sometimes not just different, but perceived as wrong. That the way that they go about doing something is not only different than your way, but it's wrong. It's just not the way you do it. This is what Paul was dealing with. Paul was a Jew who was going off into the Gentile communities, and Jews oriented their entire lives around the Torah, the law. And we know that later on, Paul says that he was the best Jew there was, which meant that he followed the law better than anyone else. He was a Pharisee. He was really good at the cultural practices of being a Jew. But he had this experience. And this experience was that God showed up to him while he was thinking he was good and changed him and transformed him and then called him to preach the good news to those who were different than him. And so we know his theology was that while you were weak, God comes to you, and that nothing can separate you from the love of God. But he was bumping up in these Gentile communities against these practices of the Roman people. And the Jews, well, they saw the Romans, and those Romans were violent. They were pagans. They did all sorts of things that were bad. That the Jews could not understand what it would mean to be part of this one body of Christ when you still lived like that, because they were just wrong. And we see here in this chapter of Corinthians, Paul working that out, because what was happening in this community of Corinth is you had this Jewish community and then the Gentile community that Paul had connected to. And in that day and age, when you would eat meat, all meat was first sacrificed at the butcher house in that time, which was the Roman temples. And so they would sacrifice a portion of the meat to the Roman gods that were there, and then the rest of the portion would come to the people that had offered up the goat or the cow or whatever. So it was impossible in Greco-Roman society to eat meat ever unless it was first sacrificed to a Roman god. And so you can imagine if you're a Jew living in Roman Empire, how disruptive that would be. We believe in the one God, Yahweh, not those pagan gods that we're sacrificing this meat to. And so, but the Gentiles were saying, well, this is what we grew up doing. This is the butcher house for us. We've done this all of our lives. What's it matter? And then the Jewish community was saying it matters a great deal. Because when you sacrifice that animal to that God, you're proclaiming something about that God. Elsewhere, when Jesus is asked a question about what to do with paying taxes, that was the same question that was coming to him, because for some Jews, they felt that they could not even participate in the economy of Rome, because anytime you would use a coin, on that coin was imprinted an image of the Caesar and the phrase, "He is divine." So anytime that you used Greco-Roman money or the Roman money, you would proclaim in that moment that this Roman governor was also God. And so some Jews said we should abolish our use of that money altogether. And then of course the other side says this is the money we've grown up using our whole lives. What's the problem? And you see, the thing is that it's so easy to build up sort of this list of the things that you should do as a Christian, or whatever faith that is. And to say you have to do A, B, and C to be doing it right. And these are ethical guidelines that we bind ourselves to, and whether that's, you have to be diverse, or whether that's you have to believe these certain things, we all tend to do it. We all tend to set up these sort of lists of what it means to be good. And then Paul kind of steps into that, and he realizes what he was remembered from his own journey is that he was following a list really, really well. But he was also completely in the wrong. And that's the challenge about culture. When is this a God thing, and when is this a culture thing? That's what Paul was wrestling with. When is this an essential thing that we have to orient our lives around, and when is this something that God is really, not really needing us to do? Or that we can be different people coming at it from different angles, and we're all together in one body. So do you have to eat meat or not? Do you have to be circumcised or not? Do you have to be male or female, slave or free? And then Paul declares to people that you are all one in this one glorious body of Christ. That we are one people. And the thing that what Paul does, he does it so uniquely. He invites people to the table. And I don't think that it's a unique thing that this conflict happens around food. Because when you're at a table and you're able to eat, and you're able to have a voice, and you're able to be at that table, something changes. Some of you remember the moment when all of a sudden you show up to Thanksgiving and you no longer are relegated to the kids' table. You know what I'm talking about? Right? That before you're over there and kind of doing your thing, but then all of a sudden you show up from college and you're like there at the table, and then your uncle's talking to you about politics, and your aunt is asking you a question about what you want to do when you're done with school, or whatever that is. But you come to that table and you realize I'm treated as one of the adults, and then you have these little nephews and nieces that are over there at the table, right? And you start to realize what it means to come to the table and be one with the people there. And that's what Paul says to this community. He says, you need to come to this table irregardless of those practices that you think are so important to you. That we are all invited to the table. Because what? What's his core theology? Remember from last week? That while we were sinners, Christ came. And that nothing can separate us from that love. And that's the foundation of his table. But Paul doesn't stop there, because Paul also makes a space for those people that ultimately he disagrees with. Because, that Jewish community that was saying, hey, it's really important for us to eat meat or to not eat meat. These practices are really important to who we are as a community. Well, he also makes a way in this letter to Corinth to say, hey, they're welcome at the table as well. And he tells the whole community, he says, you shouldn't do something that causes your brother or sister to stumble. And that's when it gets really hard, because you know what I really don't like? I like everyone to gather around the table, but I tell you what, when someone starts to give me an opinion that I don't like, I don't want to be at that table with them anymore, right? And it gets hard. You know, it gets hard because you have that family member that just knows your buttons to push. And when you sit at the table, they're going to push them. And they're going to say something that bothers you. But we're all at the table. And that's what Paul invites them to. And the thing, though, that I can't emphasize enough is this divide in Corinth. That Corinthians were divided amongst the Gentiles and amongst the Jews. And the thing about it is that sometimes this phrase that Paul says, that you shouldn't cause someone else to stumble, is used as a way to tell someone else again how they're supposed to act. So, although it doesn't matter if you eat meat or don't eat meat, well, you shouldn't end up eating meat because it might cause your brother or sister to stumble. But that argument has been deployed in a lot of contexts that I think miss the text. It's been used against women to say, hey, women, you need to dress certain ways because your male counterparts, well, they're going to look at you wrong. So you need to take the responsibility to dress a certain way. It's been used in certain contexts to say that, even for slavery or for child labor law. It's used in all sorts of contexts to say, well, yeah, it is okay, but you got to stay over here. And the one thing that you cannot miss is that the Jewish people were a minority oppressed people living in a foreign land. And so when Paul makes a space for them at the table, he emphasizes two things: that you are welcome as who you are, and that God always stands on the side of the marginalized. That God always stands with those who are weak. And that was that community. And so he was creating a space, as hard as it was, for them to be one. For the Gentiles with different cultural practices, and the Jews who were this minority community within that church, because they were Jews and Christians, to come to this table. And that's complicated. And that's difficult. And you got to work out what that means, because we have different cultural practices from different places. In Hawaii, I think we know that more than anyone, because we have people from all over the place. You have people that grew up in Indiana, people that grew up in Hawaii, people that were from the Philippines or Japan, or the cultural influences on all of them. And so as I reflect on my various cultural experiences, I wonder, what would it have looked like in high school had I had this ethic of Paul? How would I have treated those immigrants in my community so much differently if I would have created a space for them at my table? How would we treat those around us differently if we create a space for them at table around 2 points: that nothing can separate you from the love of God ever, and that the weak and the marginalized and the oppressed belong here more than anyone else? What would that look like to be that sort of a table? How might Paul inspire us to invite people to that table? This morning is World Communion Sunday. And so I'm talking about communion in part because this is what we celebrate as United Methodists and also as Christians throughout the globe. That we share in this one interesting and complex table with people who believe things fundamentally different than us. Who in the same room we might get into arguments because they might watch Fox News and someone else might watch MSNBC, right? Or it might be more cultural. It might be the differences between African and American, or Filipino and European. But we're all welcome at this table, Paul says. Because while we were weak at that right time, God sent God's Son, and that nothing can separate you from the love of God. That nothing can separate you. So come to the table.